The smell hits you before you see anything. A thick, greasy odor that coats the inside of your nostrils and refuses to leave. It's the smell of rendered animal fat, of pemmican left too long in the sun, of men who haven't eaten anything fresh in months. Welcome to the Canadian wilderness of the 1700s, where fur trappers survived on a diet that would horrify modern nutritionists. A diet built almost entirely on animal fat. They called it the Lard diet, though lard was actually a luxury. What the trappers really ate was whatever grease they could get their hands on. Bear fat, beaver fat, moose fat, the rendered tallow of any animal unlucky enough to cross their path. Fat was survival. Fat was fuel. Fat was the difference between making it through a Canadian winter and freezing to death in a snowdrift. To understand why the fur trappers of early Canada ate the way they did, you first need to understand the brutal mathematics of survival in the northern wilderness. A man working hard in -40-degree temperatures needs between 5,000 and 7,000 calories a day just to maintain his body weight. That's 3 to 4 times what a modern office worker needs. And those calories had to come from somewhere. Plants were useless. The Canadian winter lasted 8 months. Nothing green grew. The berries of summer were a distant memory by October. A trapper couldn't carry enough dried vegetables to last a season, even if he could find them. Carbohydrates were essentially unavailable. Protein was possible through hunting and trapping, but lean meat alone couldn't provide enough calories. A man could starve to death with his belly full of rabbit, a phenomenon the trappers called rabbit starvation, so they turned to fat. Animal fat provided 9 calories per gram, more than twice what protein or carbohydrates could offer. A pound of pure fat gave you over 4,000 calories. It was the most efficient fuel available in the wilderness, and the trappers learned to eat it in quantities that seem impossible today. A working fur trapper in the 1700s might consume a pound of pure fat every single day, sometimes more. They ate it straight from the kettle, spooning rendered bear grease into their mouths like soup. They mixed it with dried meat to make pemmican, the original energy bar. They spread it on hardtack biscuits when they had them. They drank it melted in hot water when they had nothing else. The taste was something you got used to, or you died. There was no middle ground. Pemmican was the staple food of the fur trade. The word comes from the Cree language, meaning manufactured grease. It was exactly that. Dried meat pounded into powder, mixed with melted fat in roughly equal proportions, sometimes with dried berries added for flavor and vitamin C. The result was a dense, portable food that could last for years without spoiling. Making pemmican was a brutal process. First, lean meat had to be cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or over smoke until it was completely desiccated. Then, it was pounded with rocks until it became a fluffy powder. Meanwhile, fat was rendered by boiling chunks of animal tissue until the grease separated and floated to the top. The fat was skimmed off, allowed to cool slightly, then mixed with the meat powder while still liquid. The mixture was packed into bags made from animal hide and left to solidify. Good pemmican was a marvel of caloric density. A single pound contained around 3,000 calories, enough to keep a man going for most of a day. It didn't freeze solid in winter. It didn't rot in summer. It could be eaten raw, fried in its own fat, or dissolved in boiling water to make a thick, greasy soup called rubaboo. Bad pemmican was another story entirely. If the fat wasn't rendered properly, it went rancid quickly. If the meat wasn't dried completely, it rotted inside the fat coating. If insects got into it during preparation, the finished product writhed with larvae. Trappers ate bad pemmican anyway, when they had no other choice. Rancid fat was still fat. Maggots were still protein. The Hudson's Bay Company provisioned its employees with pemmican purchased from indigenous peoples, primarily the Cree and Assiniboine, who had perfected the art over generations. A single voyageur canoe might carry several hundred pounds of pemmican, enough to fuel a crew of 12 men for months. Without this indigenous technology, the fur trade would have been impossible. But Company pemmican was for the lucky employees at trading posts. The independent trappers, the men who ventured deep into the wilderness to gather their own furs, had to make their own food or starve. Their diet was whatever they could kill, processed into whatever form would last. Bear fat was the most prized. A large black bear, killed in autumn when it was fattening for hibernation, could yield over 50 pounds of pure fat. This was rendered into lard that stayed soft and spreadable even in moderate cold. Unlike the tallow from deer and moose, which turned rock hard below freezing, a trapper who killed a fat autumn bear had fuel for months. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy, not for its meat, but for its fat. The flat, scaly tail of a beaver contains a thick layer of fat just beneath the skin, with a flavor that reminded some trappers of fish. It was roasted directly over the fire until the skin blistered and peeled off, revealing the greasy meat beneath. One trapper wrote in his journal that beaver tail tasted like the finest bacon. Though modern taste tests suggest his standards had been considerably lowered by months of starvation, the trappers also ate parts of animals that modern people would throw away. The brain was consumed because it contained fats useful for tanning hides, but also because it provided calories that couldn't be wasted. The intestines were eaten, sometimes raw, sometimes stuffed with fat and dried meat, to make a primitive sausage. The bone marrow was extracted and consumed as a concentrated source of fat and nutrients. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. Throwing away food in the Canadian wilderness was throwing away survival. The preparation of animal fat was an art form that every trapper had to master. Raw fat, straight from a freshly killed animal, was inedible. It was tough, chewy, and coated in blood and tissue. It had to be rendered, a process that took hours of careful attention. First, the fat was cut away from the meat and sliced into small pieces. These were placed in a large pot or kettle and heated slowly over a fire. As the temperature rose, the fat began to liquefy, separating from the connective tissue that held it together. The liquid fat floated to the top while the solids, called cracklings, sank to the bottom. The trapper had to watch this process carefully. Too little heat, and the fat wouldn't render completely. Too much heat, and it would burn, becoming bitter and potentially toxic. The perfect temperature was just below the smoke point, maintained for hours until all the liquid fat had separated. The rendered fat was then strained through cloth to remove any remaining solids, poured into containers, and allowed to cool and solidify. The result was clean, white tallow or lard that could be stored for months without spoiling, as long as it was kept cool and dry. The cracklings were not thrown away. They were eaten as a high-protein snack, crunchy and salty and surprisingly satisfying. Some trappers preferred them to the fat itself. They were like the ancestor of modern pork rinds, but made from whatever animal had been available. When fresh meat wasn't available, the trappers survived on their stored supplies. A well-prepared trapper might enter the winter season with hundreds of pounds of pemmican and rendered fat, plus dried fish and meat. This had to last until spring, when hunting became possible again. The calculations were precise. A man needed at least 2 pounds of pemmican per day, more if he was doing heavy physical work. A winter season lasted roughly 6 months. That meant a single trapper needed at least 360 pounds of pemmican to survive, plus whatever he could supplement through hunting. Few trappers worked alone. Most traveled in pairs or small groups, sharing resources and dividing labor. 2 men needed twice the food, but could also hunt twice as effectively. The mathematics of survival favored cooperation. Trading posts were oases in the wilderness, places where trappers could resupply and rest. But the food available at trading posts wasn't much better than wilderness fare. The Hudson's Bay Company sold dried peas, corn, and flour, along with tea, sugar, and tobacco. Fresh food was almost never available. Even at the posts, the diet was heavy on fat and carbohydrates. The rum that the company sold was another source of calories. A pint of rum contained about 1,200 calories, plus the psychological benefits of temporary intoxication. Many trappers spent their earnings on rum, trading away furs for liquid courage to face another season in the wilderness. The company encouraged this, knowing that indebted trappers would have to return with more furs. The relationships between European trappers and indigenous peoples were complex. The indigenous peoples had the knowledge and skills that made wilderness survival possible. They taught the Europeans how to make pemmican, how to build canoes, how to navigate the waterways, how to read the weather and the animals. Without this knowledge, the fur trade would have failed completely. In return, the Europeans brought trade goods that indigenous peoples valued: metal tools, blankets, firearms, and, unfortunately, alcohol. The exchange was rarely equal. The Europeans took far more than they gave. But in terms of wilderness survival skills, the debt flowed entirely in the other direction. The voyageurs, the men who paddled the canoes that transported furs and goods across the Canadian waterways, had their own dietary traditions. They ate pemmican, of course, but they also consumed massive quantities of peas and corn when available at trading posts. These carbohydrates provided quick energy for the grueling work of paddling and portaging. A voyageur's daily ration, when fully provisioned, included about a quart of dried corn or peas, a pound of fat or pemmican, and whatever fish or game could be caught along the way. They ate this food in 2 massive meals, one at dawn before setting out, and one at dusk after making camp. There was no time for lunch. Every hour of daylight was precious for travel. When provisions ran low, the voyageurs ate what they called le petit nord, the small northern meal. This meant reducing rations to survival levels, often just a handful of fat, and whatever could be foraged or hunted. Men lost weight rapidly on le petit nord, sometimes 20 or 30 pounds over a few weeks. But they kept paddling. The indigenous peoples of Canada had their own sophisticated fat-based diets, developed over thousands of years. The Inuit of the Arctic consumed almost nothing but animal fat and protein, eating raw seal blubber and caribou fat in quantities that astounded European observers. Their bodies had adapted to this diet, processing fat efficiently without the health problems that might afflict people from other cultures. The trappers learned from indigenous peoples, but their bodies weren't as well adapted. Many suffered from digestive problems, especially when first transitioning to the all-fat diet. Diarrhea was common. So was a condition called fat sickness, where the body rejected excessive quantities of grease with violent vomiting. The trappers learned to introduce fat gradually into their diet, building tolerance over time. Scurvy was the ever-present threat. Without fresh fruits or vegetables, vitamin C deficiency was inevitable. The trappers knew that something in green plants prevented the disease, even if they didn't understand the science. They ate spruce needles boiled into tea, a practice learned from indigenous peoples that provided just enough vitamin C to keep them alive. They ate the organs of freshly killed animals, which contained traces of vitamins that the mussels did not. They survived, but barely. The physical effects of the lard diet were visible. Trappers who spent years in the wilderness developed a distinctive body type: lean muscles covered with a thick layer of subcutaneous fat, like seals or polar bears. Their skin became oily. Their breath smelled of grease. Their sweat carried the odor of rendered fat. They looked, in a sense, like the animals they hunted. Some trappers developed a genuine craving for fat that lasted their entire lives. Men who had survived Canadian winters eating nothing but pemmican and bear grease found themselves unable to enjoy lean meat ever again. It seemed dry, tasteless, wrong. They needed the fat. Their bodies had rewired themselves to require it. When trappers returned to civilization, even temporarily, they often continued eating massive quantities of fat. Observers at trading posts noted that returning trappers would consume entire pounds of butter at single sittings, spread on bread or eaten straight. They would drink cream by the cup. They were fat addicts, and civilization couldn't cure them. The lard diet was dangerous in ways the trappers didn't understand. We now know that excessive saturated fat consumption leads to heart disease, stroke, and other cardiovascular problems. But these long-term consequences didn't matter much to men, whose average life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. If the heart disease didn't kill them first, the cold would, or the bears, or the rapids, or 100 other hazards of wilderness life. The seasons dictated what the trappers ate. In autumn, when animals were fattening for winter, the diet was relatively abundant. Bears, freshly stuffed with berries and salmon, provided the richest fat of the year. Deer and moose were at their peak weight. Even the beavers were plumper, their tails thicker with stored fat. Winter was the leanest time, paradoxically. The animals that remained active were burning their fat reserves, just as the trappers were. A deer killed in January was stringy and lean, providing protein but little of the precious fat that kept a man warm. The trappers relied heavily on their stored pemmican during the darkest months. Spring brought relief, but also danger. The ice on rivers and lakes became treacherous, making travel deadly. Animals emerged from hibernation thin and desperate, providing little nutrition. But spring also brought the return of migrating waterfowl, whose eggs were a precious source of fresh food after months of preserved meat. Summer was the season of preparation. The smart trappers spent summer hunting and drying meat, rendering fat, making pemmican for the coming winter. Those who wasted summer would pay for it when the snow fell. The grasshoppers of summer became the starving of winter. My grandfather once met an old trapper who had survived in the Canadian wilderness during the 1880s, near the end of the fur trade era. The man was in his 80s, but still ate butter by the spoonful, straight from the tub. He said he couldn't taste food without fat anymore. Everything else was just roughage. His body had been permanently changed by decades of the lard diet. The mental effects of the diet were harder to measure. Some observers noted that long-term trappers seemed calmer, less emotional, more stoic. Whether this was a physiological effect of the high-fat diet, a psychological adaptation to the brutal conditions, or simply a selection effect where only certain personality types survived, nobody knew. There were darker psychological effects too. Men who spent too long alone in the wilderness sometimes developed what the French-Canadian trappers called la folie du Nord, the madness of the North. They would talk to themselves, see things that weren't there, forget their own names. Some said it was the isolation. Others blamed the diet. Perhaps it was both. The human mind wasn't designed for endless months of darkness, freezing temperatures, and nothing but grease to eat. What we do know is that the lard diet created a distinctive culture. The trappers developed their own slang, their own customs, their own ways of thinking about food that were completely alien to people from settled areas. They measured wealth in pounds of fat rather than dollars. They judged a hunting ground by its potential for fat-producing animals, not its scenery. Their entire worldview was filtered through the lens of caloric survival. By the late 1800s, The fur trade was dying, and with it, the lard diet. Commercial food became available even in remote areas. Trappers could buy canned goods, dried vegetables, processed foods that provided calories without the exclusive reliance on animal fat. The old ways faded away. The last generation of traditional trappers found themselves obsolete. Their skills, so valuable in the wilderness, were useless in civilization. Their dietary habits, necessary for survival, became medical curiosities. Some adapted. Many didn't. They died in boarding houses and back alleys, unable to function in a world that had no use for men who could survive on pure fat. The transition wasn't immediate. In remote areas, the old ways persisted into the 20th century. Some indigenous communities continued making pemmican using traditional methods. Some old-timers taught the skills to a younger generation, keeping the knowledge alive even as its practical utility faded. Today, there's a small revival of interest in traditional wilderness foods. Survivalists and outdoor enthusiasts study pemmican recipes and fat rendering techniques. Some people experiment with high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets that echo the lard diet in modified form. The ketogenic diet, which became popular in the early 21st century, is in some ways a descendant of the fur trapper's all-fat survival strategy. But nobody lives that way anymore. Nobody has to. The Canadian wilderness that once demanded a pound of fat per day now has highways and supply chains and refrigeration. The desperate mathematics of caloric survival have been replaced by the comfortable mathematics of grocery shopping. Today, the lard diet survives mainly in the memories of indigenous communities and the journals of long-dead trappers. Nobody eats like that anymore. Nobody needs to. Our supermarkets are full of cheap calories from 1,000 sources. We have the luxury of choosing what to eat based on taste and health, not pure survival. But for 2 centuries, in the frozen wilderness of Canada, men survived on nothing but animal fat and determination. They ate what they had to eat. They lived as long as they could. And when they died, their graves were marked by the bones of the animals that had kept them alive as long as possible. That is the story of the lard diet. The story of men who ate pure grease to survive. The story of a forgotten way of life that built the foundation of a nation. The next time you spread butter on your toast, think of them. Think of the men who would have killed for that butter, who would have eaten the whole block in one sitting and been grateful for it, who lived on fat because fat was all there was. Their diet would horrify us, but their survival inspires us still. And somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, in a forgotten clearing now overgrown with spruce, there might still be the remains of a trapper's cabin. Inside, if you looked carefully, you might find a blackened kettle. Run your finger along its rim, and you might feel a thin film of grease, centuries old. The last trace of a man who lived on fat, survived on fat, and perhaps died reaching for one more spoonful. That grease is his monument, his only memorial. The story of the lard diet, written in rendered animal fat,